This is the DRF Sports Forum Podcast. Here's your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Sports Forum Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back in Brooklyn, back in the bunker with proper audio equipment in front of me and not European traveler people talking loudly in the next room. Much more comfortable than episode 2 of the Sports Forum Podcast is this episode number 3. I'm joined once again by 2 guests who've had a lot to contribute in the brief history of this show. We'll start off with the man who is the managing editor of DRF Sports Forum and a fine handicapper in his own right, Scott Gramling. Scott, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Peter. Great to talk to you as always.
And we're going to bring him in, the man from the planet Texas, back on the planet Texas after a long weekend in Lexington where he did pretty well in a little handicapping contest down there. We'll talk more about that in the late week edition of the DRF Players Podcast, our sister podcast. But on this show, we don't worry about his past achievements as a horse racing handicapping champion. We just know him as Mr. Friday Night Lights himself. He knows about high school football, he knows college football, and he knows a little something about the NFL, as his picks in his 2 weeks on this show have demonstrated. I'm talking about JK, Jonathan Kinchin. What's up?
What's going on, PTF? Yeah, I'm lucky enough last week I had a little layover in Dallas and got to run over and watch 3 guys I used to coach with. They're all on the same staff now at Flower Mound Marcus High School in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and got to watch an LSU commit, a Alabama offer, and an Oklahoma commit all in the same field at the same time. So I watched the first half of that game. It was nice to bring back those memories.
That's very, very cool. I love it. All right, let's get on to talking about some roundtable NFL questions to start off the show today. Going to have a special one-on-one interview coming up later in the show. My friend and fellow podcast host, really the OG sports betting podcast host as far as I'm concerned, Gil Alexander, going to be joining us. And then I have a little speechifying I'm going to do at the end of the show, actually in the form of a tale from the track, because while this is a sports betting show, there's plenty of crossover between horse racing and sports betting. And this is a story I think that fits. So we'll get to that at the end of what will hopefully be an entertaining hour. But I want to start off with these 2 gentlemen talking about this year's NFL season. Watched a ton of football last week, and it left me with plenty of questions, maybe more questions than answers. And I wanted to start off by talking about what I perceive as sort of an old school talent division in the NFL, where I feel like we have this very clearly defined upper class of teams, a handful of teams who just seem better than the other teams, as opposed to some of these years where it seems like the NFL's dream of parity has become very real. And I'll start with you, Scott. Do you think we can pretty much just play the championship games now, or at least break it down to 4 teams left in each conference? Or do you think there's room for some changes and some of the teams from the middle of the pack to establish themselves along with the elite teams we've seen so far?
You know, I don't mean to have a cop-out answer here, but I think it's kind of in between the two. I don't feel as strongly as you do about the talent divide, but what I do feel strongly about is the quarterback divide. And I think that's really what's dividing the haves and the have-nots. And I think that there are just more and more and more have-nots as the years go on and really as the season goes on. I mean, as always in the NFL, injuries will play a factor and will be the great equalizer in the end. But that aside, I think that what you have here for the most part is your Super Bowl contenders being from teams that are getting strong quarterback play. I would say with the exception of the Ravens, which I don't really perceive as being a true championship contender, even though they've looked very tough. I think they've looked tough against relatively weak competition. And I'll save what I need to say about their their game this week, going up against the Saints, which I think will be a good barometer for where each of those teams stand. But I think it extends a little beyond. I mean, let's be honest, last year, who saw in mid-October that Jacksonville would be a participant in the AFC Championship game? I'm not ready to anoint any of these middle-of-the-pack teams to be this year's Jacksonville, but I think it certainly can happen, and there probably is a bit more parity than maybe what it seemed to be on the surface through the first 6 weeks of the season.
Fair answer. JK, how about you? You seem like the type, if the way you bet football is anything like the way you bet horse racing, which we know about from the other show, you seem like you might already be getting the Rams Patriots Super Bowl T-shirts printed up. Is that a fair assessment?
I think in the NFL, you want to follow quarterback play, and it's for a few reasons. If you look back at the rules changes that we've seen in the NFL the last 5 to 10 years, like every rule that has been changed is in the favor of the offense. And so I think that the like you mentioned, the difference between the quarterback talent is definitely going to lead you to finding the teams that are going to end up in championship games. You know, the Patriots, the Chiefs, the Saints, the Rams. Those quarterbacks, those teams all have elite quarterbacks that are playing at an elite level. And those are the 4 teams that I think most people would have a hard time finding other teams to end up in the championship game. So I think the quarterback play is definitely when you want to follow when you're looking to kind of nab an early Super Bowl contender at this point of the year.
And what do you think about these teams that appear to be elite? Are they for real? Is this sort of like the NBA where we can pencil them into the Super Bowl based on what we've seen? Or are you keeping more of an open mind like Scott probably wisely is?
Well, I think it's safe to say that things happen, weather happens, home games happen, fumbles happen, injuries happen. I think that I would be shocked if either the Rams or the Patriots weren't the representative on one side for their conference. I'm not saying both of them will make it, but I think it's a pretty high probability that one of them will. The Rams obviously are playing well on offense. They've got an unbelievable young coach who's been very impressive, and then they have all the pieces they need on defense. I don't need to explain why the Patriots are a likely AFC team to represent the AFC, but I would think that one of those teams will be there. Now, what happens if the Saints go in to play the Rams in Los Angeles, the weather's nice, and Drew Brees goes off for 500? The Saints can beat the Rams in a playoff situation with one game. It's not the most likely of scenarios, but it can definitely happen. And the same thing can happen with the Chiefs. The Chiefs can go into Boston and beat the Patriots, but I think one of those teams will definitely be there.
But you're not necessarily calling your friend Marv out in Las Vegas and getting ready to book some future action. You're taking more of a wait and see approach.
Well, the part of that correct. I am calling Marv, but not to bet Super Bowl futures.
I don't know. We may have just violated some laws there, so we'll just move on. This next question.
I'm just calling him to say hello.
Okay, there you go.
Letting him tell me a story. I'm sure he's at the buffet somewhere. It's Wednesday night. He's usually at the buffet, and he's probably doing a little bit of resting with the Horseplayer World Series contest that was out there. He's probably stressed out running around rooting for Duke.
There you go. He is at Marv Betrunner on Twitter, so definitely a very worthy follow for folks who don't know, and one of the good guys. Always a great casino and racetrack character, our good buddy Marv. This next question might be a case of confirmation bias. We talked last week about the effect that the specific enforcement of the quarterback rule has had on betting. Everybody took sort of a wait and see approach. Is it just confirmation bias? I feel like we did see some examples of defenders letting up, perhaps in fear of penalties, in games that ended up going up crazy over. Is that just confirmation bias, or is there anything potentially to that? JK, I'll start with you.
I'm not a real big believer in that rule affecting the over, the under, the total, the outcomes of football games. I think just like anything, there's certain little scenarios where it might really matter. Obviously, the Packers would probably like to think that they have a couple losses or a tie or so on their record just based on that rule. But I don't think it's going to impact the overall over or under of a football game. For me, those situations are dictated by the pace of the game, turnovers, field position, completion percentage, special teams, things like that. Not so much one penalty. One penalty doesn't make an over/under.
Scott, are you still where you were last week? Am I just grasping at straws here, trying to justify my original hypothesis?
No, Peter, I don't think you are. I think we saw a real example of that with Breeland Speaks, the defensive player on the Chiefs, clearly letting up on Tom Brady, which just felt to me as if it was a reaction to coaching during the week, and I'm speculating here. By no means do I have any insight, but coaching that might have gone on around the league where coaches are telling players, look, this is what's happening here. You got to let up on these guys. You can't drive the quarterback into the ground. You can't hit them late. Those penalties kill us. And now the pendulum swung too far the other way, at least in this one instance. And it would be hard to believe that this is just an isolated instance. This was certainly the most glaring one because of the fact that it happened in prime time at a very key point in the game. But Speaks clearly let Brady go, thinking that he had already released the ball. And it does make you wonder, are defensive players being coached to say, err on the side of caution, don't be taking these 15-yard flags? And, that being said, does the pendulum now swing back the other way where this game film is shown around the league to defenders on various NFL teams who are now told play to the whistle? So we're still in this middle ground here, and I think the players are still figuring this all out, and it might still take a couple of weeks until it does get figured out. But Peter, I think that your point was it was seen in action on Sunday night at a very, very key point in the game that could have ended up being the difference in that game. I mean, who knows how things end up transpiring after that. But I think the point you made certainly was validated to a certain degree with Breeland Speaks loading up on Tom Brady.
JK, with your coaching background, from a rules perspective, what needs to happen at this point? You guys have both made points in this show about rule changes favoring the offense. It does seem obvious that every rule change that's come down the pike since who knows when has seemed to favor the offense, like JK said before. What can be done to try to level the playing field? I mean, offense is fun and everything, but isn't it a better game when you get to see a little bit more balance between both sides of the ball? And what can be done about that?
I mean, I don't think anything's going to be done about it. If you look on the other, not the, all the people that work in these offices with cubicles, you can stand up and look at 17 people that are playing fantasy football. And they play fantasy football because there's points being scored and it's exciting. The quarterback's throwing it all over the place, the receivers. The rules aren't going to be changed, not only because it's more exciting game with offense, also is because of the injuries. They're trying to protect knees and ankles and heads and shoulders and all kinds of different things. So they're not going to make the rules changes. I think that what can happen and what you'll see happen, like with many rules changes, the illegal contact, the holding on defense, illegal hands to the face, all those things. Coaches will do little drills and, in pre-practice, little 5-minute drills where the quarterbacks the defensive linemen are sacking a dummy and they're working on, not landing on them, rolling on them, just trying to have some muscle memory for some ways to avoid those calls. But there's also going to be some defensive coordinators in the NFL that are going to say, I don't care. Like, we'll take that penalty. I'm fine with that penalty. If we get 1 or 2 of those a game, I don't want to change the aggression of my defense. I'm not saying all the coordinators are going to say that and all the head coaches, but I guarantee there's a handful that aren't going to ask their players to quote unquote slow down or be careful. I'm sure there's old defensive coordinators rolling over in their graves at the thought of guys of letting up a little bit.
I still see Leonard Marshall and Joe Montana as a New York Giants fan in my when I think back to the glory days of that team and some of the violence you used to see on field. And I'm not advocating for that. I'm all for rules that promote player safety. What we've seen in terms of head injury stuff in the NFL is very real and very disturbing. But I just thought in terms of X's and O's, in terms of the rule book, and then we'll move on just to make this point, that there's got to be some way without endangering player safety to just bring defense back into the game, to me, just because it's – but you make a good point about the fantasy football ification of the NFL, and it just might be a byproduct of that. Another thing that occurred to me watching games this weekend is, in addition to the elite teams, it seems like we have – and this is not a new thing. This is something that seems to happen every year. But a lot of teams that might be described as Jekyll and Hyde, the two sides of each team. And this made me think a little bit about horse racing and horses who sort of go in and out of form, and it's hard to evaluate them. And the question it made me want to ask, and I'll start with you, Scott, is how important is consistency to you in choosing a betting vehicle, a team to wager on? Would you rather try to figure out what makes the Jekyll and Hyde team clicks and make wagers based on that? Or do you really value a team when you think you have a really good handle on what they are?
I like the Jekyll and Hyde teams because that's where I think you can find value. And as listeners to last week's episode heard, one of the teams I really liked was the Dolphins. And as much because I didn't like the Bears, because I think the Bears are one of those teams that tends to play better at home than on the road, was not nearly as good as what they were in that 48-10 win over the Buccaneers prior to their bye. I think that's where you can find real value. I feel like with the consistent teams, it just comes down to, is it going to be a 6-point game or a 3-point game, which really can be the same spread. It's a one-score game, and those, to me, are the tough games to figure out. I thought the Patriots-Chiefs game last week was tough to handicap at the 3.5, 4 number because I thought it was the right number. I think that odds makers have an easier time putting lines on games with consistent teams in them. And I think because that's easier for odds makers to make the line, the flip side of that is it's harder for the odds makers to make the lines, the inconsistent teams. Therefore, that's where you can find the value. I hope that made sense.
Oh, it's utterly logical. It's a great answer. JK, with horse racing, obviously, I mean, to me, I'd much rather bet on the horse that's consistent, try to get a line on that horse versus the rest of the field. But in racing, we're obviously putting ourselves in situations, whether it's through exotic wagers or even just the win market, where we can get a big return on the money. Scott's point to me, when you're dealing with all these 10 to 11 situations that come up in football, it's a point well taken. Is there a difference for you between the two enterprises? Where do you come out on this issue?
I mean, I think the New England Patriots are justified. They make their own trip, right? They're well coached. They have a good quarterback, consistent quarterback. They have all the tools. They know how to win. They have a defense that bends and doesn't break. They're the justified if you're comparing it to a horse race. Now, you look at a team like the Chicago Bears, for an example. Yes, they're pretty darn good on defense, but they've got a rookie quarterback, so they're inconsistent. They need a setup, right? They need the pace to fall apart in front of them so they can come running late. They're not going to always be able to make their own trip in a race or in a game. They're going to need things that kind of go their own way. I think that this whole conversation from earlier till now, it's all based on the consistency of the quarterback play. And when you have a consistent quarterback who doesn't turn the football over, who reserves the right to kick, whether that be a field goal or a punt, doesn't give short fields, you got a much better shot of being a more consistent football team. Now, when you have a rookie quarterback who's throwing it to the other team, who's getting sacked, who's getting fumbles, who's missing wide open receivers and things of that nature, it serves for a lot more of an inconsistent run throughout a football game or even a football season.
Who'd you rather bet on?
Oh, to say I'd rather bet on Justify than Gunnavera. So right. I want the team that's going to make their own trip. I want the team that that when they're down 14, you say to yourself, this isn't ideal. However, I still have a shot. The Packers game on Monday night, it was a struggle the entire football game. But anyone who bet on the Packers or is a Packers fan knew the game was always in reach because they had a consistent quarterback. And no, the Packers have not been consistent. And like Scott said last week, I don't think they're very good, especially on defense. And they having not two receivers not play will hurt them as well. But they do have that consistency in their quarterback play, and I think that can kind of make up for some of those other things.
I agree with everything JK is saying. I think one of the main differences here is when you're handicapping football, you're trying to identify losers as much, if not more so, than you're trying to identify winners. And that's, I think, where I'm saying the inconsistency comes in, where I'm looking for an overvalued team that's not necessarily consistent. I feel like with the Patriots, with the Packers, maybe not this year, but in past years, the market has a good handle on how to price them, and you have to pay a high price for that consistency that they have year in, year out, week in, week out. I like at this point in the season the volatile teams that, like the Bears, coming off a 48-10 win, being overvalued to the point where that line, I know Tannehill ended up being out and he was replaced by Osweiler, but Ryan Tannehill is no Johnny Unitas, and I don't think that line should have moved as far as moved. And I had taken it at 3.5. Getting the 3.5 with the Dolphins, and I felt I had no other choice than to bet it again when it got all the way up to 7. Truth be told, I actually got it at 6.5. I thought I would go back down after that. But I think the point being in this conversation that, it's great to have the safety of the consistency. I just feel like it's tougher to uncover inequities in market when you're dealing with those year in, year out, game in, game out, consistent teams that you can rely on.
It makes perfect sense, and it comes back to the idea that we always talk about in the other show of what your betting personality is and what you're trying to accomplish. I think particularly with JK's betting style, we've talked a little bit about it on the show, and we'll get into more depth at some point. But when a lot of your action is tied up in teasers, I could see those consistent teams being more valuable given his choice of betting vehicle. Where Scott, I assume you're more of an individual game bettor, and I can absolutely see from a handicapping point of view and betting more individual games that your way is better. There's no right or wrong answer. Yeah. I think it really just comes down to how you approach the game.
That's a good point. A great point.
Let's move on to talk about some specifics this week. Scott, you will have a whole boatload of picks available in DRF Sports Form, also in the Platinum Sheet, and in the Best Bets product, all of which are available from DRF. I asked you this last week, and I swear I'll do the plug next time, but hit me one more time with what is the best place you think for people to go and be able to access all of that stuff?
Yeah, Peter, foxsheets.com will be the place to go that has the various things listed on the navigation bar, and it will take you in each and every direction that you need to go to have a profitable weekend, week in and week out.
Lots of great actionable statistical information, computer model, power ratings generated by a computer model. Yeah. Very, very interesting. Definitely a great underpinning for all your football handicapping. So if you want all of Scott's info, you can get it in there. But you've been kind enough on this show to point us in a few directions in the first couple shows, and hoping you're willing to do so again. What are some of the games you're the most interested in as we head into this next week in the NFL?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like I'm copping out here, but I'm going to use a similar betting system that I used last week in picking the Dolphins over the Bears. And that betting system was that teams that were outscoring opponents by an average of 10 points per game or more, coming off back-to-back games of allowing 14 points or fewer, had been 2-15 against the spread since the start of the 2014 season. I know that sounds like to some people a lot of gobbledygook and numbers thrown out there, but the logic behind it is market inequities with teams that are blowing out other teams just being overvalued in the market. And that's what the Bears were. They were overvalued largely because of that blowout win against the Buccaneers. They had been coming off the pair of games, giving up 14 points or fewer, and that same system applies this week to the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are a team that's outscoring opponents by 10 or more points per game, and they're coming off back-to-back games of allowing 14 points fewer. And with that result last week, it's just an overwhelming system to go against that kind of a team. And I do think the Ravens are overvalued here going against a Saints team that's coming off a bye. You look at what the Saints have done coming off a bye in recent years. They are 8-1 against the spread. See, I'm already counting this win. That's what to do.
That's how confident you are.
That's it. 8-1 against the spread, coming off a bye since the start of the 2009 season, and get this one as well. And I'll tell you why this I think is relevant. Last 16 October games, the Saints are 14-1-1 against the spread, and that to me is a trend that has some logic to it. It's not one of these, when the moon is full on a Thursday night and the temperatures are between 62 and 68 degrees. No, I think that what it shows with a team like the Saints that has had consistency over the years in its coach and quarterback, which is a theme that's really been part of the show leading up to this segment, you can kind of gather a personality of the team. And the Saints have consistently underperformed early in the year to what the expectations were, and that was certainly the case this year, where they lost to the Buccaneers at home in week 1, much to the chagrin of a lot of survivor pool people out there. And they won by the skin of their teeth in week 2 at home against the Browns. After those 2 games, the market overreacted the other way. And the fact of the matter is the Saints, for whatever reason, and there are theories as to why this is. One of the theories is a relatively complex offense with new personnel, even though you have the same quarterback and some of the same receivers, but getting that offense to gel takes a couple of games in the season. But by October, it's a combination of they've been undervalued because of how poorly they've performed early in the season, relatively speaking. I mean, this is a 4-1 team, and that by October, they're really hitting the stride. And I think you have the combination here of them coming off a bye, which I think is significant for the Saints because of how potent they are offensively. Gives them extra time to game plan, to put some new wrinkles in it. They almost treat it, from what I've heard, as a sort of halftime of the season to make certain adjustments and then come out of the bye. And not only are they 8-1 against the spread coming off a bye in the last 9 years, the over is 8-1 as well. They've just been putting up a ton of points. The last 2 years, 52 points last year coming out of the bye, 41 points against the Panthers the year before coming out of the bye. I think you combine the October record that shows this is the time of year the Saints really start to put it all together. You look at them coming off a bye, and then on top of that, you have the betting system of the Ravens being overvalued. And to me, this is my favorite play, not only of the week, but of the year thus far. And I've had some very tasty plays. Anybody that tuned into what we were doing week 1, that Chiefs-Chargers game, to me was as misconstrued a line as I have seen in an open-end week game in years, and I had reasons why I think it was. I think it was all lumped into the regular season over-under win totals that Vegas has set, and then had kind of backed into what was a very false line of the Chargers being favored by 3.5 over a superior Chiefs team, and a Chiefs team that had performed well coming into seasons for a couple of years under Andy Reid. This is just this same play to me from every angle I can look at. And I do always look at the other side of the coin, and I'm trying to find reasons why I should take the Ravens in this instance. I cannot find an angle why you should take the Ravens over the Saints here. Saints getting points in Baltimore, and it is a misnomer that the Saints don't perform well outdoors. That's the way it used to be going back 3 and 4 years. That's not the case anymore. This is a big time game to play. Saints getting the 2.5 points at Baltimore.
A thorough analysis, and you sold me. I think I got stuck on the road game thing, but everything you say makes sense to me. Lots to follow up on in there for Coach Kinchin, but I'm going to put a pin in that for another show because I don't want to keep you guys too long tonight. JK, what are your strongest plays heading into this weekend?
One of the teams I was really kind of interested in following, I thought they're doing a lot of the little things I like to see teams do correctly when you're trying to evaluate how good they are. And that's the Jacksonville Jaguars, who got their doors blown off on
that was ugly.
But to Scott's point, now I think that the market might, if they were to win that football game on the road and blah, 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 there's a lot of ifs, but I think that they're still a good football team. I think that the Houston Texans are a bad football team. I think that the Jacksonville, now being at home with a little bit of an added focus, you show up to work a little bit different on Tuesday morning when you just got beat 40-7, especially when you're a team that has some success, that has some leaders on defense. I think that their coaching staff will have their attention this week. And I think the Jaguars will definitely rebound at home against a team that doesn't have a good offensive line, that has been woeful in the red zone, and the Texans. And I like the Jaguars from a straight perspective. I don't do a lot of straight betting, but I do like the Jaguars. They're straight. And then for some of the games I'm still looking at when it comes to the teaser situation is the Chiefs. You can tease them down to a little bit better, but just a pick at home against the Bengals. You can also get the Rams down to under a field goal against the 49ers. I think a lot of people saw the 49ers, and although the backup played well, when you have that much money on the sideline and on crutches with a quarterback, a starting quarterback, and a running back, it's going to affect the rest of the way your team looks. And I think a lot of people that watch the Giants, they're in turmoil there as well with Odell.
Don't remind me.
Odell acting a little bit like my 7-year-old when he can't have ice cream. I think the Falcons are going to be tough at home in a dome on a Monday night, and Matty Ice can throw that thing around a little bit. So those are some of the teams I would look at it from a tease standpoint to bring down to just needing to win.
All right, very logical stuff. Just to underline what you're saying about Jacksonville, it had occurred to me that Houston do seem very fortunate to have the record that they do based on some of the things that have happened in the last few games. So I just want to underline that aspect of
can I underline that a second time? Because we actually wrote in this week's sports forum, Houston has put together one of the least impressive 3-game win streaks in recent memory.
I would have to concur, having watched portions of 2 of those games. All right, yes. We're going to let the roundtable guests go. We've got more for you on the DRF Sports Forum podcast, but we're going to let these gentlemen get on with their week. Scott, great talking to you.
Great talking to you as well. Always a pleasure. Everybody out there, thanks for listening, and I hope you all have a very profitable weekend.
Cheers. And JK, we'll let you go for now, and we'll bother you to pick some horses a little bit later in the week on the DRF Players podcast.
All right, PTF, see you in a few days.
And for this week's one-on-one interview segment, I want to bring in a very special guest. A few years ago, when I was asked to do betting seminars at Saratoga, before I accepted the gig, I first needed to call my friend and mentor Harvey Pack, with whom I'd first worked when he was hosting such seminars at Saratoga, and I asked his permission to do so before I would formally accept the gig. I called Harvey, asked permission. He told me, "You're dead to me." But then he allowed me to do the show, and I did it. Similarly, when the idea of the DRF Sports Forum podcast first came up, I needed to ask permission of a friend, because as far as I know, in the podcast world, this man is the OG. And if you're not listening to him already, you definitely should be. You can find him in podcast form, the Beating the Book podcast. You can find him on Twitter at Beating the Book. You can also listen to him on Sirius XM channel 204, 10 to noon Eastern, 7 to 9 Pacific on VSiN. Did I get all that right?
You did.
This is Gil Alexander. Welcome to the show.
Peter, you're dead to me. Let's start there.
It's not the first time I've heard that. So glad.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Excellent. And I just wanted to get you to reflect on the sports betting podcast or audio show of any kind landscape from when you began doing one to now.
Oh, I mean, it's night and day, or, I mean, to use a better comparison, I guess I can't come up with one. I mean, when I started doing the first time I ever did a podcast was in 2005. So literally, like, I read something about this new technology, the advent of this new technology, where I could just go to Staples or your local convenient, electronics store and buy a headset with a mic. And through very few, presses of the clicks of the keyboard or clicks on your computer screen, you could podcast to the world. This thing, broadcast from your computer. And I had 5 listeners the very first time, but one was in Germany and one was in Fort Lauderdale and one I think was in Australia. And immediately it was like this moment where you realized, oh my God, because think about it. If you now we take all that stuff for granted. But in 2005, like the notion of not being, the notion of being able to broadcast outside of your metropolitan area in anything radio-like or broadcast-like was just this, we couldn't even fathom it. And so when that happened, it was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. I can really do a show from scratch about anything that I want. And for me, the authentic thing to do was to do a show about sports betting, because that's what I love doing. And I thought there was a vacuum in that particular arena for someone who actually did it honestly and didn't just tell you, oh, I never lose. I'm 26-1 in my last 27 documented. And so that's where that started.
Oh, that's great. And what is your reaction when you see today where, my mom is thinking about starting a sports betting podcast?
In fact, she called me. She is starting hers tomorrow. Everybody's got one. You're right. So I think it's great, right? Because this is, listen, I started I did my first one in 2005. I started doing a regular podcast for the first time starting in 2010, which is still the dark ages of podcasting. But from then I really haven't stopped. And this is exactly where one like myself back then would have hoped this would come, which is not only does everybody have a sports betting podcast, but now we have a dedicated sports betting Sirius XM satellite radio station dedicated to sports betting in VSiN, which is where I work. And now you're seeing major networks with legalization in, the Supreme Court ruled PASPA unconstitutional back in the summertime in May 14th, I believe it was, to be exact. And since then, we've seen several states legalize sports betting, and there will only be more to come. And so you're seeing the Fox Sports of the world, the ESPNs of the world, trying to figure out how they are going to incorporate sports betting programming. So it is a brand new world, Peter. That's for sure.
Do you think it's a case, from your perspective, of a rising tide lifting all ships with all this additional coverage? Or is there some part of you that's just like, hey, you, Fortitow, all you guys, get off my lawn?
Yeah. Look, I'm not human if there's not a little bit of that, right? Like you try to suppress that part of your brain because that's just stupidity, right? Like that part of our weaknesses as human being. There's nothing productive to that emotion. But yeah, you do have that moment where you're like, these young whippersnappers thinking they can do, No, but it's just stupid, right? Because what you always try to do, or what I always try to do, is stay one step ahead of, where I believe the masses are going to go and do something new and innovative and interesting that no one else is doing. And to the extent that I can do that, I think I've sort of succeeded in what I'm trying to do. But I think that this is a very exciting time. I do think that sort of the way I would answer that question, though, is I do think, and this has nothing to do with me personally, but I think whenever a new subject matter to the masses like gambling is explored, and sports betting is a very nuanced language and a very nuanced currency. You can't hope to learn it in a week. You can't fake it for a month. You can't even fake it for a year. Like, you really have to it really has to be in your DNA, not to be corny about it, but you really live this stuff. You do with horse racing. You're now, expanding into sports betting. I think that the first wave of this stuff is probably not going to be really good. Right? Like, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about just the way the networks handle it. Those that have not been immersed in it like you and I have for so many years, they're gonna have a lot more mistakes than they are successes early on.
That makes perfect sense. I think you're obviously so well positioned between what you've done in the podcast world, but also your podcasts themselves in many ways being a nod to the history of intelligent talk in this area. And I'm talking, of course, about the Guessing Lines show. For those that don't know, where did that idea originate from?
That was the old Stardust radio show, which is just a legendary show here in Vegas, which was Sunday nights, where they would pretty much release the first lines or announce to the world what the first lines would be for the following weekend's NFL games. My friend Roxy Roxborough, who's a Vegas legend, who's the founder of Las Vegas Sports Consultants. And by the way, the greatest night you could ever spend in Vegas is going to dinner with Roxy.
Agreed.
And just keeping your mouth shut and letting Roxy tell stories. It's the greatest thing in the world. But it's basically a tribute to that show. And I do it with one of Roxy's dear friends, Chrissy Andrews, who is the director of the South Point Hotel Casino. And one of the great things that has been a part of that show for so many years is the story time that Chrissy has been kind enough to share with us through the years. One
of the many things I've stolen from you, Gil. In fact, a little bit later in this show, we're going to have our Inspired by Storytime segment, me doing the talking this time with our tales from the track. But as much as I've stolen from you over the years, I'm pleased to say I don't even think I'm in the top 5 in terms of some of the outright theft that I've seen at this point.
Yeah, I don't, Peter, it's such a strange position to be in, right? Because your instinct is to be like, wonder where they got that idea from, right? Like that's your first instinct. And then if you whine too much about it, you end up being the bad guy, right? So like you're only allowed to complain about it to a certain degree. So I guess I would just leave it with imitation is the finest form of flattery. And so that's just what makes the world go round. And it gets back to, as long as you stay one step ahead of the game, people remember who did it first and who did it, the way that certain people did it. So people aren't dumb in the end.
Who does it first and who does it best? I was going to use the flattery line if you hadn't beaten me to it. Specific question about the Guessing Line show. I'm a regular listener, but I just wonder, when you do that mental exercise in your head, are you more concerned with guessing what the public is going to do, or are you more concerned in your brain with what the price should be? And at what point does what the price should be enter into the equation if it's the former, not the latter?
That's a great question. That's the perfect question for that show. And by the way, I have to remind myself of that periodically when doing the show, even after so many years. What I'm essentially trying to do on that show is I'm trying to guess what the market will have that line at. And in that remains separate from what my handicap of that line ought to be. And in that exercise, that's where we isolate, or that's where I try to isolate value. That's the whole exercise. And what's nice about that is that people can, it's sort of the old game show. You can play at home. It's sort of interactive, right? So while I'm guessing what the line ought to be on the radio, folks listening can also make their own guess of what they think the line should be. Now, I've got my own number, and I think the market's going to have its own number. Oftentimes it's the exact same. Oftentimes it's only off by a half point. But there are times, believe me, and there are weeks, this past week being one of them, where I will be off a lot. And much of that has to do with, I think, the nature of the NFL these days, which is that so many of these teams, good Lord, they're so Jekyll and Hyde that I don't have a feel for maybe a third of the teams in this league. I don't remember another year where I could say that this deep into a season.
I used the same phrase in the first segment on today's show. That may have been me subconsciously plagiarizing you. Apologies yet again. I can't let you out of here without talking about the Megapod. I love it. I haven't missed an episode in years. Tell us about the evolution of that format and why you think it's had such staying power over the last several seasons.
Boy, I don't. The truth is that certain things just have something that you can't really define. And I think the Megapod, which, by the way, for those who don't know, and thank you for talking about it, is I do 2 NFL podcasts per week during the season. The first is Guessing Lines, which we just talked about, which is on Monday, guessing the following week's lines. And then Thursday, we basically are previewing that weekend's games. And the Megapod is the one on Thursday, and it's me as the host. I have 2 staples of the show, handicappers here in Las Vegas. One is Marco D'Angelo, who's been in the business 39 years. And as I like to say when we do our Derby shows, my line is always, and now a gentleman who has seen each and every Kentucky Derby live.
Always makes me laugh. And especially when you busted it out on the football show, I almost ran into a pole while jogging because you made me laugh so hard.
As we know, how many derbies do we have now? 140 some? How many is it?
I should know that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I honestly don't. I think it's what is it, like 154? I should know that. I may have to edit that to make myself sound smarter. No, I won't do that.
I apologize. So it's Marco D'Angelo on one side, and then it's Ace on the other. Ace, who's a longtime handicapper here. Marco is more of a situational guy, an old school handicapper that doesn't believe in numbers so much as he does he's learned these rules through the years. He can't really tell you why these things are true. They just are. And so he goes with it. Ace has access to many accounts of sharp bettors, so he has a window into what sharp bettors are betting. And then we have a third guest, which is a rotating guest from week to week. And sometimes it's an analytics guy. Sometimes it's a Vegas professional bettor who isn't necessarily into analytics as much. It's all kinds of folks in the business. And something about that show, and I give all the credit in the world to Marco and Ace, quite frankly. They deserve all the credit for that show. And when we all say it, that show gets more response on Twitter, that one episode, than all the other stuff we do combined. Those guys' personalities are such that, and there is a busting of the balls nature too much of that show. I think that's one of the things that people appreciate, that while we are serious about football, it's very around the sports bar kind of talk. And so we have a great time with it. And those guys are wonderful. They're funny. They're insightful. And we just have a really good time with it.
It's so much fun, but it's more than just fun. It's super informative. And I find with that show that it doesn't matter if I agree or I disagree with what's being said. It helps color my opinion one way or another. Even if I disagree vehemently, sometimes that will push me onto an actionable play. And then there's other times where you're just picking up a great tidbit. I think my favorite dynamic is where you combine both of those approaches, which are unique in the ways that you described, with one of the more analytically inclined guys, just because that's such a fun perspective that sometimes you can hear occasionally you'll hear the eye rolling over at the approaches, and I love that tension. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just these different ways of solving the same problem.
You've given it a better endorsement than I could ever, and I think you've distilled what I love about it so much, which is just that, which is sports betting. And the reason I decided to do a sports betting podcast on it so many years ago, or a podcast on sports betting specifically so many years ago, was that for me, sports betting and all the elements of it is so fascinating. It's human psychology. It's a reflection of the human condition, how folks deal with adversity when their betting goes wrong. It's such a reflection of other things in life. how people believe their approach sometimes is the only approach and they know everything and no one else knows anything. How some people are more humble, how the top 2% might be just as smart as the top 2% in any other industry. There's so many different things about it that fascinate me. And you talked about just, I think, the thing that's so great, and this might apply to horse racing as well, which is the humility to understand that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I think if I've learned anything from that show and from sports betting for so many years, is that one has to have the humility to realize that their way is not the only way. The most analytical guy, the most mathematical guy on one side of the spectrum might be right a lot. But for them to dismiss the Marco D'Angelos of the world, guys who do things that the more mathematical guys might consider to be smoke and mirrors, well, you shouldn't dismiss it that quickly because, they know some stuff too. There's something about experience. And oftentimes the truth or the best answer sometimes lies right in the middle. And so I think that's what I find so fascinating. And you said it best. Sometimes you can cut the tension. You can hear the tension. And it's a fascinating dynamic.
It's great. It reminds me a little bit, I know you're a big baseball guy, but the tension in baseball between scouting and analytics, I think there's a similarity. And that actually leads well into my next question. You're obviously a believer in analytics. In this day and age, when so much of the market is made up of smart computer money, which are making sense of those analytics in ways that were not the case 10 years ago. You would look at, I think the best example to me is the baseball over-under lines for the season. I feel like 10 years ago to 15 years ago, crazy inefficiencies. Like you could look at that board and just find bets after bets and bets that you, as an analytically oriented player, you just did not think were going to lose. It's gotten so efficient, and I see that in so many markets now. So for you, in a day and age where those analytics are being priced in more than ever, what is the role that analytics play in your actual handicapping? Because we haven't talked about this, but you're a fine handicapper yourself in a number of sports.
Well, thank you for that, first of all. And I think there's a great point that lies within what you were just saying, which is, and the season win totals market in baseball is a great example. This was the first year where I had a losing record on baseball season win totals, maybe ever that I can remember. And I don't do a whole bunch of them. I just do a handful every year. But usually I'll go 2-1, 3-1, 4-2, just nothing dramatic, but I'll get the best of it. And you're right. Even that market has gotten to the point where it's like, yeah, but stuff happens. And the analytics don't necessarily manifest in the way that you thought they would at the beginning of the season. Now, I don't want to take 1 year as gospel, but what it does end up making you do, and I try to do this on a numbers game at VSiN, Sirius XM Channel 204. My show's 7 to 9 Pacific, 10 to noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. What I try to do on that show, if I can impart anything, is that especially with a new wave of bettors now with legalization, Peter, is we should not be hamstrung into the construct of what we've all believed the only way to bet has been all these years, which is you bet games against the spread, what I like to call pre-flop, to use the old poker term, before the game starts, their season win totals and their futures. There are so many other ways to bet. And in-game wagering, live betting, has become so much more a part of if you look at my betting pie chart, if you will, like it's so much more of how I bet now than it ever used to be. And the UK, I used to have a guy on my podcast named Andrew Garoud, who was the lead developer of the Midas algorithm for Cantor so many years ago. And he used to say, believe me, this will happen here eventually. And it has happened to me. And so the opportunities that I see are more creative than they ever used to be. Tankapalooza was something that I talked about for 2 months at the end of the NBA season last year. Like, hey, look, don't be afraid to bet these big money lines against teams that are actively tanking. You have to be able to isolate situations that are going to come and go, regardless of the sport. And in-game wagering, for me, presents a lot more opportunities than does the pre-flop markets, which you accurately stated, I think are so efficient now up and down the board throughout the sports betting calendar.
I couldn't agree more about the opportunities that come up in game. Part of it, I think, that stuff's happening in real time. There's not the same opportunity for the smartest few percent of the market to make those efficient. That's definitely part of where that equity is coming from. But in terms of the type of plays that you make, where would you say the equity is coming from? Does it have to do with looking at analytics in game? Does it have to do with something more basic of watching a couple of drives in a football game and seeing something you think is going to continue throughout the 60 minutes? Where's the equity?
Yeah, I mean, this does get into the area of, well, okay, how much do I want to talk about right
Fair
now,
enough.
right?
Totally fair.
Yeah, because there are things that I like, well, I don't want to do this thing in baseball, I don't necessarily want to say. But I think that's also part of the way this goes, right? There's certain things you want to talk about. So let me answer that with something that we did that I did and was open about on my show for the last 2 or 3 years that now already I don't do anymore, which is first inning markets. Literally, like, will a run be scored in the first inning, yes or no, in any given baseball game? For about a 2 or 3 year period, that was our that was the sort of way I was weaning off pre-flop baseball. Like, there was a market that could be exploited because it wasn't priced correctly. And so there was any number of games a day where you could just beat that into the ground. So that was one thing. And that, by the way, to answer your question, that was completely based on just historical data, right? Of this is how teams perform in first innings. And it was particularly pronounced when certain types of pitchers were on the mound. And so that was all based on data. That was all something that was based on math and the naked eye could not have seen. Similarly, what I'm doing now is also based on historical data like that. It's just a different exploitation within the game of baseball, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And I didn't mean to totally put you on the spot there, but I think you gave folks stuff that they can, that's really something that can be chewed upon. And I think you really hit on something when you're talking about new markets. And also, I think something to take a look at for folks is when changes happen, rule changes can lead to opportunities before the market catches up. I think the newer opportunities definitely are ones that you have a chance to get the best of it. And I mean, a silly one, this was just me picking up nickels off the floor. It wasn't anything very creative. But at the start of the World Cup this year, knowing that they had the video review for the first time, very early on in that contest, I got the idea that would lead to more goals just because of, these penalties being awarded. So just taking that knowledge and sometimes as conservative as betting against a 0-0 draw, which you can do over there, and then sometimes just incorporating it into over-unders. But of course, I'm sure that's probably caught up with by now, the way that computers operate.
Right. Yeah, so even as you're talking about that, and you're right, you were very astute to recognize that early. What often gets talked about most in mainstream media. So eventually people caught on to the video replay, the VAR in the World Cup. A lot is made of, these defensive rules in football, the laxed, all the rules are in favor of the offense. So totals, keep an eye on totals. What people are normally talking about, those are the things that the market has already factored in, right? Like it's already too late on those things. Sometimes, and I'll just leave this hanging, sometimes the things that are the most exploitable have been right in front of us all along, and we just don't talk about them.
I like that. It's a mystery here on the DRF Sports Forum podcast.
How is that for a cliffhanger?
Every podcast needs a good cliffhanger. Let me talk to you a little bit.
I don't want to be that guy, by the way. I don't want to be that guy who comes on your show and then says, I don't want to give you a pick for that game.
No. I'm asking about some down the rabbit hole things that are important to your business model of life. Actually, that's a good next question. At this point, the balance in your life between broadcasting and gambling, I'm someone who can relate. I had years in my days before working for Daily Racing Form where gambling was as important to my income as writing was. And I'm at a point now where it's just this teeny little slice. When you get involved in doing all this broadcasting and writing and stuff, it can become hard to find time to give gambling its due. It still seems like gambling is an important part of your professional portfolio. How do you balance the two?
It absolutely is. But let me just throw in this. There was a period in my life where that is all I did, right? Like as you were talking about with you, it was much more of a part of your pie. For me, there was a time where that's all I did. And now, because of, the podcast turning into a radio show, it's just the fact of life for me that I'm going to spend most of my time doing that now. That's just how my life has evolved. And quite frankly, based on, getting older, I think that's appropriate. And I think that's what I need in my life. And that's what I want in my life. This is very much my career now. And that's how I've always wanted it. I'm still betting for sure on a daily basis. It's just not my 24/7 life anymore. And for me, that is a perfect evolution, and it's where I want to be. But so by definition, though, I am because I get income from an actual job and from, ancillary income like a podcast. And I do a show with Jay Rude, the vice president of race and sports at MGM. We do videos every week. Because I'm getting income from other sources, I am no longer, in my opinion, a professional gambler, right? I'm a very serious gambler, but that is not my only thing in life anymore.
It makes perfect sense. And it always annoys me when I hear people, typically just randos on Twitter or even in real life who will say, well, if so-and-so knows so much, why is he giving his picks out there? Why is he doing a radio show, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, yeah.
And I know from experience, why he does that? Because maybe he wants to know when his next paycheck is coming in. It's like,
it's such a great point because, and by the way, Twitter, the echo chamber of Twitter, good Lord, what a pool of humanity that is in gambling Twitter. But to your point, I've always laughed at that when people, so this is particularly directed to people who sell their picks, right? And and the charge is, well, if you were that good, why would you sell your picks? And I always laugh at that because I'm like, what a arrogant, lazy comment. And they don't even realize it's arrogant and lazy. Do they say that about stockbrokers? Right? If you're so good at telling me what to buy as stock, why do you have this job? Right. And what it is that it's an assessment. Like those people who say those things, they're judging other people's risk averse nature. So basically they're telling people who sell picks, and we can argue the merits of selling picks till the day is done. But the people who say, well, if you're so good, why are you selling? Basically, they're making a judgment about how risk averse those other people should be. So if a guy who sells picks is also betting and they just choose, as you say, to get another source of income from this, why should you care and judge them for that? Like, that's just, you don't have to buy the picks. Right. You could tell other people not to buy them if you don't want to, but that shouldn't be the reason. The reason for you to disparage them is not, oh, if you were so good, you shouldn't be selling. That's their business, not yours.
Yeah, I always said as a freelancer, which I am again, by the way, Daily Racing Form still a key client, but out there in the world doing other things. I always used to say that the dollar when it's coming in is worth at least twice the dollar that will be coming in, but you don't know when it's going to be. It's just a fact of how, as adults, we need to plan our lives.
You know what I said earlier, which is like the reason that I did a podcast on sports betting is I'm fascinated by all the psychology around it. And maybe the biggest example of that is the fact that by nature, people who bet, and particularly the most professional bettors, because they like to predict future outcomes, because we all do, there is a strain that often comes part and parcel with that, which is not only do I want to predict the future outcomes of sporting events, but I also want to tell you how smart I am about it and how dumb you are about it.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a fascinating weakness in human character. And I'm endlessly interested in just how flawed our little piddly human brains sometimes can be. I mean, I am. I know people might listen to that and be like, wow, this is different. But I really am. Like, that fascinates me more than anything, like how some people can't get out of their own way with that. If you're a great gambler and you think you're smarter than everybody else, why can't you just do your thing and shut up about it? I don't get that either.
Go to the windows and make a bet. My friend Frank Scatoni and I would always have this conversation. Would you rather be rich or be right? And there's a lot of people out there who would rather be right than make money. And I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you get out of here without making a pick. I will not hold your feet to the fire as to what this pick is. We can talk about the World Series. We can talk about an NFL future. Heck, if you want to pick a game next weekend, you could. And don't worry, I know you've been known to give out 30-1 Super Bowl winners. We won't we won't expect anything quite that lofty. We'll take anything.
Well, just to poke fun at myself, yes, I did give the Eagles 30-1 a year in advance, but you know what I gave a year in advance to this year's Super Bowl was the Texans at 20-1. So guess who's laughing? Not so smart after all, Peter.
Just when you think you've got it all figured out.
Yeah. I don't know. Let's see. What can I say that's like halfway smart? Geez, I don't know. I think that here's what I would say. I think we know who's going to be in the respective championship games in the NFL already. I think we know that the LA Rams are going to play the New Orleans Saints. Apologies to the defending champion Philadelphia Eagles. I think we know that. And I think we know that the Kansas City Chiefs are going to play the New England Patriots in the AFC Championship, with, again, apologies to the Chargers. And I won't even apologize to the Steelers. I really won't. But I really think we know that. And I know Ravens fans, you're like, come on. I just think we know, and I think we know this in mid-October.
At least 17 people in Minnesota just crossed you off their holiday card list, Gil.
You know what that is? I'm a Washington Redskins fan. I know Kirk Cousins better than you guys do.
I love it. All right, I got to let you go. I kept you longer than I said. The show is a numbers game. The station is Sirius XM 204. This is part of VSiN. Gil on 5 days a week, 10 to noon Eastern, 7 to 9 Pacific. Also, go to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to the Beating the Book pod twice a week. They're both fantastic. I haven't missed either episode in years. And did I get your Twitter right before?
At Beating the Book, yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, my friend.
Peter, thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
And now a tale from the track. So as most of you know, last week I was in England and was able to do one of the things I really enjoy doing when I'm in England, and that's go to see new race courses. So I headed down to Brighton Racecourse, which is sort of the closest thing they have at a UK racecourse to Del Mar, right on the water, up on the hill. We got lucky. It can be very cold that time of year. It was a bright, sunshiny day. Had my 5-year-old daughter Perrin with me and was hanging out with my friend Barry Faulkner, who is a terrific racing aficionado, also has some great stuff about rugby. Heck, if we do a podcast ahead of the Rugby World Cup, we might have to have Barry on to give some tips. And I noticed his play throughout the day at Brighton, and he was very unlucky. He had bet a bunch of horses in the morning. One, I think, was 8-1, ended up going off 5-1. Another was 3-1 and ended up going off at like 9-5. Every horse he bet was shortening. Of course, over there with fixed odds, he still got those good prices, and the market just closed after him. Unfortunately, none of those horses won. But I made the point to him, well, hey, you're doing it right. As long as you're making these bets at these prices, and the market, which is the best single predictor of any piece of data of what's going to happen in a race, is going off shorter, you're essentially winning even if you don't know it. And I said something to the effect of, at least you're getting the value. And he just looked at me deadpan. And this is kind of an old saw in gambling, but it was just the perfect usage of it. Looked at me deadpan and said, yeah, but you can't eat value. And that is, I just thought, is such a great line. And it definitely does feel that way sometimes when we're in losing runs, especially. it can be very difficult to just pride yourself on the fact that you're getting the best of it. But at the end of the day, you need to take pride in the fact that you're getting the best of it. Now, I don't want to confuse that with the kind of fuzzy horses that we'll find from time to time, and fuzzy teams or scenarios in sports betting too, that are big prices, but you kind of have that intuition if you really think about it. They may be value in theory, but their strike rate is going to be so little that for me, with my betting personality, I don't want to key too much around them. I call them, and our colleague at Daily Racing Form, Brad Free, laughed very hard when I told him this theory years ago. I call those horses value losers. And that's not to say that you shouldn't maybe bet a little bit on them to win, but those, we've used the term in the podcast a few times, those type of betting vehicles often better to key underneath and try to get your value that way. Now, back to the idea of you can't eat value. It certainly has some validity. At the end of the day, you need to be hitting bets if you're going to make money in the long run. But if you can have the patience and settle yourself and settle your mind knowing you got the best of it, even if you didn't get the right result that time, you're going to be a far better player in the long run. It's the whole idea that you should be focusing on the decisions that you're making, not the outcomes that you're getting. You can't eat value, but you're not going to last very long if you don't keep it on your side. And that is the end of this edition of the DRF Sports Forum podcast. I'd like to thank guests Scott Gramling, JK Jonathan Kinchin, Mr. Friday Night Lights, and also the great Gil Alexander for joining in, producers Craig and AJ as well. Most of all, would like to thank all of you for listening. When you're betting this weekend, I hope all the bounces go your way.